there. This is my commentary on Chapter 27 of Lila, An Inquiry into Morals by Robert M. Pirsig. So this is a very short chapter, and it's sort of an exposition. The kind of thing that can happen, or why it's very difficult to take care of severely mentally ill people. And he's talked a lot about Lila and her mental illness in a very ambivalent way. It's really problematic, but he was insane himself at one point. And there's something in that insanity that he explored in the last chapter. But here we're just looking at the practical considerations of having to be in charge of someone who's extremely mentally ill. Things like the law don't really matter much to them. Remember, all their social patterns have been kind of demolished. So here you've got the hostility of a delusional woman, and you've also got the audacity of this demi-monde type, or Jamie, that she hangs out with, and the type of people she generally did hang out with. So Phaedrus doesn't have much common sense, it appears. He needs Rigel for that, and so do we. We need our Rigels, because common sense is to be found on and in the social level. That's why the intellectual level is such a conundrum. On the one hand, it's at the top of the social hierarchy. It comes with the ideas that fuel society and improve society, improve our lives, etc. But it's so sequestered from society that nowadays you see so many weird ideas coming out from academia as it's really catching up with the intellectual level, that they are so removed from their support, which is the social level. And so you got someone like Phaedrus who kind of, he's not exactly like this because, you know, he understands the boat, etc. So he's keyed into the nature of things. But when it comes to the social level, he's kind of an example of someone who's pretty clueless, you know, like the nutty professor who's socially inept. He's not that bad. He's at least a little polite at times, let's just say. But he doesn't really have much of that communal common sense. Excuse me. So Rigel comes in as a representative of what the best thing to do in a particular social situation. When, as Rigel says, you can be here for 5 minutes or for 5 weeks. So logically, Phaedrus is probably thinking, well, I didn't do anything wrong. What's going to happen to me? But Rigel understands the nuances of the social level, and he's a lawyer, etc. So he's a representative of what Phaedrus is missing, let's say, in this particular case. One of the first sentences in this chapter from the open-minded Pirsig is something that would get him canceled today. Talking about Jamie. He was black with a big grin on his face and a white tunic that was so bright and clean it knocked out everything else. He looked like he just stepped off an Uncle Ben's rice package. Boy, oh boy, would he get it for that. And, you know, it's funny reading this way before all this cancel culture stuff, and it is just such an anodyne description, but it's not anymore, so it's kind of interesting. And this is, of course, an example of the intellectual level being completely clueless. So Jamie's used to Lila's BS, but it seems he's not been around her in her mental illness state, let's say. And we know she's been in this state before because she's been in the hospital. She had the medications. Rigel knows about it. And it really throws him for a loop. And as we often do with mentally ill people who do bad things, we act as if they had a choice and they made a bad one and they're going to pay. So Jamie, ironically, considering what he's there to do on the boat, i.e. steal it at the expense of Phaedrus's life maybe, makes a big production about complaining to the cops. And there's some kind of trope in here. I don't know what, though. So in Lila's mind, the whole idyllic delusion is easily broken by Jamie, who comes in because he's part of that world that she's escaped, that she's finally escaped through this delusion, you know, that transactional lower world. And he's the bad guy here, again, who's trying to rouse her back into reality, which is the last place she wanted to be. And after the whole fracas, Phaedrus goes and talks to her about it and tries to figure it out. Why did you do it? He asked. He killed my baby. How? She pointed to the floor below the bunk. Phaedrus saw the doll laying face down on the floor. He watched her for a moment, wanting to be careful what to say. Finally, he said, "Shall I pick it up?" Lila didn't say anything. He picked up the doll very carefully in both hands and carefully set it beside her, because he knows. This is a bad place, Lila said, and by that I think that she means the bad place is reality, or at least is the prevailing agreed upon social level understanding of reality. Bad place for her, definitely. One thing Paul Go noted is that it seems like Phaedrus, and this is toward the end of the chapter, a very short chapter, the intellectual liberal is running away from the city, as many of the people who could did in the 70s and 80s when New York wasn't yet gentrified, and what happened during the pandemic. So it's kind of a metaphor of escape from the degenerate New York City, and filthy, degenerate New York City, that the elite and the gentry can easily fly away from. In the case of Phaedrus on a necessarily expensive boat, because all boats are expensive. And this end part is what's most interesting to me. As he looked back over his shoulder, he saw the water of the river between the boat and the marina become wider and wider, and the figures become smaller and smaller. They seemed to diminish in importance as they diminished in size. The whole city was starting to take shape from the perspective of the water now. The marina was sinking back into the skyline of the city. The green trees of the parkway dominated it now, and the apartments rising above the parkway dominated the trees. Now he could see some large skyscrapers at the center of the island rising above the apartments. The giant. It gave him an eerie feeling. This time he'd just barely slipped out of his grasp. And let me reiterate the, escaping from the monster type situation that we just described. Also, we've spoken before about how the giant is an example of strong emergence, which is when you have a bunch of different parts that add up to something that you can't tell from the big thing that it's added up to what the small things are. And this is exactly what he's describing. He illustrates this in real time. You can't see that the figures, and then the marina, and then the trees, and then the skyscraper. Now you can see the relationship of these things as they become bigger and bigger and in some ways move up. But so you can see those let's say latches, or let's say those that evolution sort of occur in real time. But once you see the giant, you don't see these discrete things anymore, and you cannot really determine that the giant is made up of these things. You just see the city. So I hope that makes sense, and I will see you next time.